Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the second of 3 lectures by Professor Johannes von Moltke, who is the Rudolf Arnheim Collegiate Professor of German Studies and Film, Television, and Media at the University of Michigan. My name is Mary Hennesy. I'm an assistant professor of German here at UW-Madison in the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic. The George L. Mosse Distinguished Lectures is an initiative of the Mosse Program in History that aims to continue George Mosse's distinguished legacy of scholarship and teaching. The lectures alternate between the 2 institutions where Mosse taught and wrote, the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. The first lectures took place in 2002 here in Madison, and they are all available online, and this one will be as well. Professor von Moltke's lecture today is called The Identitarian Reflex, Strategies of Appropriation and Projection. Close enough. Before introducing Professor von Moltke, I'd like to briefly thank our sponsors, the Havens Wright Center for Social Justice, the Department of History, the Mosse Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies, the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic, the Jean Monnet European Union Center of Excellence, and the Center for German and European Studies. Professor von Moltke is the author of numerous articles, publications, and the editor of many volumes in both the US and Germany, too numerous to name here, on 20th and 21st century film, literature and culture, film theory and history, critical theory, and German film history. I will specifically mention his 2 award-winning monographs, No Place Like Home, Locations of Heimat in German Cinema from 2005, and The Curious Humanist, Siegfried Kracauer in America from 2015. And this is in addition to his important and wide-ranging work on Siegfried Kracauer, who was a somewhat marginal figure of the Frankfurt School, but I think, thanks to your work, no longer is. Johannes also recently co-edited an English language edition of the last letters exchanged in 1944-45 between his grandparents, Helmut James and Freya von Moltke, a profoundly personal record of the couple's fortitude in the face of fascism. His latest project, which we are in the midst of learning about this week in Madison, von Moltke has been studying right-wing media cultures, including the populist right on both sides of the Atlantic, a project he worked on last year as a fellow in the American Academy in Berlin. He is the current president of the American Friends of Marbach and past president of the German Studies Association. And finally, I would be remiss if I did not mention what is for me his most important role as my PhD advisor at the University of Michigan, where I was lucky to learn from his keen understanding of the relationships among ideology and culture, close reading and critique. As faculty here in Madison, I work to emulate the model for scholarship, teaching, and mentorship that he continues to model.
Aww. Thank you, Mary. And you guys all made a really great hire. Thanks for coming and for coming back, for those of you who are back for more. I remain extremely grateful for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk and think with you all about this. Even just the round of questions yesterday was generative, I think, for the furtherance of the project itself, so I'm definitely taking something along from that. Thank you for that. And I'll have opportunity to say it again, but Sky, thank you for putting it all together, running in it, hosting me. This has really been great. And Ophel for the invitation. Where's Ophel? There he is. I think I tried to keep this part a little bit shorter so that you can. I assume people have somewhere to be at 1, so I'll try to just launch in and see that we get out of here by. Yeah, that should work. The way I'm thinking about this, and this is one of the things that that's hard, but also a luxury to be invited to give 3 lectures, is to think about something that's longer and that can become a book. So I did spend a lot of time thinking about the to organize these things, and in some ways, what I, as I said yesterday, the kind of setup was to talk about metapolitics as a concept, how it gets defined on the right, and to think about some of the sites of metapolitics. Today, what I'm going to try to do is think more about the strategies or the how of metapolitics. So what is metapolitical thinking, so to speak? How does it work? That involves rhetorical strategies and involves conceptual reversals that can become fairly dizzying. So I hope I can walk you through them in a way that makes the dizzying clear. I'm not sure I can resolve them for you, but at least that's the goal, is to show how metapolitical strategizing intentionally produces a set of mirror effects that gave me the title, the Identitarian Reflex. So the reflex here is as much reflexive in terms of just a quick reflex, but also the reflex in a mirror. So that's where some of this will go. There's a certain fascination on the new right with George Orwell. Right-wing election deniers in the US, from Josh Hawley to Don Trump Jr., decry attacks on their election denials as Orwellian. A subreddit on r Ask Conservatives is devoted to the question why conservatives praise Orwell and his books so much. And a novel like 1984 makes the cut on the America First reading list, circulated by Milo Yiannopoulos on the internet some years back. We've almost forgotten Milo, I think, but he's still around. Little wonder then that the PragerU book club, with which we ended yesterday, would take up the dystopia, offering a masterclass in the same kind of appropriative reading that we saw Götz Kubitschek calling for at the beginning of yesterday's lecture. When the host, Michael Knowles, who, to my great surprise, I shouldn't have been surprised, but he was at CPAC just this week, and then interviewed on the PBS NewsHour in their segment on democracy. They're doing a really, really interesting series of conversations on democracy on the PBS NewsHour, and Amna Nawaz interviewed Michael Knowles, which was instructive. When the host, Michael Knowles, discusses 1984 with Dave Rubin, we pass through the mirror into a world where Orwell's text reflects not the threat of Stalinism or Nazism, but the reality of the current totalitarian liberal system. In this reading, newspeak can be translated into political correctness, doublethink into reverse racism. Orwell's proles are Hillary's deplorables, and Winston's resistance makes him a figure of identification for right-wing readers. In this reading, literature and reality align as in a pamphlet. Aesthetic autonomy is not worth a thought. I guess you're getting the real-life experience of it, Knowles tells the now 1.3 million viewers of the PragerU book club about Orwell's novel. But it's still worth, he says, reading to help you understand, especially your world right now. To be clear, by your world right now, he does not mean current attempts by autocratic regimes to roll back democracy, but in a reversal of Orwell's inversions, liberal democracy itself. Such a reading of Orwell against the grain, I hasten to add, would be the prerogative of any literary critique. And the text certainly lends itself to discussions of the expansion rather than the retraction of surveillance in liberal democracies, or their continuing oppression and disenfranchisement of entire swaths of the population. You can easily imagine an anti-racist reading of Orwell's 1984. But the two men are hardly interested in any reparative reading. Instead, 1984 in this book club becomes the occasion for an airing of grievances by ostensibly victimized white men. In their discussion of the book, Knowles and Rubin ultimately alight on the question whether liberalism has reached its end, whether the soft spots of liberal democracy have provided openings for a totalitarian left, and whether we have now returned to the book burnings carried out by the Nazis shortly before Orwell's novel was published. Except that here, book burning is taken to signify progressive academic attempts to decolonize the Western canon by diversifying whose voices get heard and querying the racial underpinnings of what comes to count as literary value. So decolonizing literature as a critical move is the same as book burning in the way that they discuss Orwell. Against such efforts, Knowles and Rubin uphold literature and reading as spaces of a struggle for survival against totalitarian liberalism, even as they hold fast to a liberal promise of self-empowerment through education. Quote, "You cannot remain a slave if you are literate and you read," they say. Stylizing himself as the righteous victim of totalitarian liberal political correctness, Knowles adds, "As they burn the books, as they topple the statues, as they erase the history, as they memory hole everything that we cherished, that we thought we could rely on, there is still a little bit of hope for those of us who are willing to crack the spine of a book or two and to see the vast difference between reality and all the propaganda that the system is spewing at us." And we'll talk tomorrow a little bit about some of the propaganda analyses that, that critical theory in the 40s was offering, where the formulation of they, the unspecified they, plays a pretty important role, that there's always some big enemy out there. If this hymn to books and the resistive power of reading echoes the pathos with which Kubitschek defended appropriative reading on the steps of the University in Vienna, that merely indexes the transnational dimension of right-wing politics. PragerU sits in California and is incorporated in Florida. What interests me today, however, are the ways in which metapolitics can appropriate an obviously anti-totalitarian text such as George Orwell's 1984 and rewire it to the new right's anti-democratic critique, albeit a critique counterintuitively carried out in the name of democracy. As we've already begun to see, there's never more than one degree of separation between the genteel intellectual pretensions of book clubs on PragerU, seminars at the Gegenuni, and summer and winter academies in Schnellroda on the one hand, and street protests like Aktion 451's 2023 happening at the University of Vienna on the other. This is very much by design. Yoking thought to action is part of the metapolitical playbook and central to the new right's countercultural aspirations. For a literal version of that playbook, we might turn to Provokation, Götz Kubitschek's inaugural volume for the Kaplaken series in his own publishing house. This is the bibliophile. It looks bibliophile. When you actually buy them, it's pretty cheaply produced. But it's made, it's clearly made to emulate, if anybody's ever been to a bookstore in Germany, the Suhrkamp publishing house with its colorful, yes, everybody's nodding. And when I said that to another audience, somebody said, that's already 19th century, the Klett Cotta publishing house already did that in the 19th century. So they're really looking for these connections. This short book, Provokation, has become a key reference point for goading the far right into action. Making good on the book's title, Kubitschek offers a manifesto of sorts, a call to arms, in what he describes as a proto-Civil War moment. The text underlines the urgency of that moment with accelerationist talk of time running out, verrinnende Zeit, and stark alternatives of life and death, resistance or disappearance. Gegenwehr oder Verschwinden. It's either or. Given the sense of imminent revolution that Kubitschek conjures up, the casual reader of his pamphlet might easily draw parallels to manifestos across the political spectrum. And the modernist manifesto is driving this text, certainly. Or so it might seem until one attends to the ethnonationalist rhetoric that undergirds Kubitschek's rant. However revolutionary that rhetoric, his is a manifesto against immigrants, against a multicultural future, and against egalitarianism. And it's a rallying cry for downtrodden ethnic Germans who need to mount a concerted act of resistance lest they verschwinden. Consequently, Kubitschek exhorts his readers to join, quote, a battle for hegemony in autochthonous space. That's my translation of the German phrase, Kampf Vorherrschaft im eigenen Raum, which in the German adds a latent resonance to Nazi notions of Raumordnung and Lebensraum. For anyone who cared to read, this and subsequent texts developed the conspiracy theory of a great replacement according to which Kubitschek's autochthonous space is under threat by so-called replacement immigration, an ostensible project to overwhelm and substitute ethnic Germans with foreign immigrants to be combated by a program of remigration. And we can talk about that, this text in particular, which is kind of at the heart of a lot that's going on politically in Germany and has been since the beginning of 2024. As I mentioned yesterday in my discussion of the accelerationist tendencies of metapolitics, Kubitschek wants social and political conflict to manifest as crisis, a crisis whose advent he would hasten with a declaration of war. That's a phrase that appears in this volume. His Provokation was meant as a clarion call to an activist new right that seeks at every opportunity to engage in the culture wars. Think not only of Aktion 451, with which I began, but also of the stacking of school boards and challenges to ban library books in the United States, the Gegen-Uni sticker campaigns in public spaces in Germany, or identitarian demonstrations in Austria. This activist strand arguably aligns metapolitics more closely with socially progressive forms of political organizing than with traditional notions of conservatism. If we were to abstract from the goals of a return to traditional gender roles, racial segregation, and what the right calls the reconquista of the state, they use the Spanish term, if we set aside the content, that is, metapolitics can certainly appear formally oriented toward renewing rather than conserving the status quo. This makes theoretical sense given Benoit's derivation of metapolitics from Marxism and the New Right's concerted effort to learn from 1968. In the German case, if we go further back in the New Right's lineage, we also find here its deep roots in the so-called conservative revolution of the interwar years, roots whose ramifications for New Right thought and action the historian Volker Weiss has reconstructed in great detail. But for Kubitschek, and for the metapolitical project as a whole, the culture wars are conceptual as much as actual. The geistiger Bürgerkrieg, that's his term, the spiritual or intellectual civil war that he has in mind, would involve the identification of enemies, he says, die Kennzeichnung der Gegner, for sure. But it would necessarily be anchored, Kubitschek insists, in the sharpening of concepts, Zuspitzung der Begriffe. What then does such conceptual work look like on the right? What is its lexicon? What are its analytical claims and its theoretical frames of reference? What rhetorical strategies does it involve? How, in a word, does the right think to sharpen concepts? We've already seen in the case of Bradbury's and Orwell's novels how the New Right instrumentalizes not just their respective protagonists and plots, but also the very acts of reading and critique for what Benoit termed a cultural revolution from the right. Drawing inspiration from an older New Left, that is, from the social movements and the earlier cultural revolution of the 1960s, this strategy, I now want to suggest, is part of a larger project of scavenging among progressive causes and poaching concepts to rebrand them as right. For metapolitics borrows not just the language of revolution from the left, but with it, the politics of identity, the languages of pluralism and diversity, even democracy and anti-fascism. These New Right vocabularies routinely integrate strategies and concepts developed in the wake of 1968. Even the New Left's self-conception as a subversive, often playful counterculture, as extra-parliamentary opposition, and as Gegenöffentlichkeit, a term developed by Alexander Kluge and Oskar Nicht in Germany, the counter-public sphere of the late 60s and early 70s. Similarly, if the student movement gained traction in part through a critique of establishment media, the metapolitical project is now construed by the right, in large part, as an attack on mainstream or legacy media, as a purported echo chamber of a hegemonic totalitarian left. From Trump to the Schnellroda-based journal Secession, the New Right now routinely adopts an earlier left's media critique, with one telltale difference. In the shift from the 1968 slogan, in Germany at least, Bild lügt, the tabloid Bild is lying, that was a student slogan. In the shift from there to Lügenpresse, which you would have heard in the first Trump administration already, in that shift, the New Right moves forward by doubling back to an anti-Semitic Nazi epithet. Lügenpresse is a Nazi term. Scholars have sought to describe these contortions and derivative gestures in various ways, defining the strategic appropriation of formerly progressive platforms as a form of discursive piracy, as what they call retortion, as mimicry, as reversal, as permanent resignification. I'm drawing terms that have cropped up in the literature on the New Right. Or I found this particularly useful, as subversion from above, which Silvia Sasse defines as, quote, the conscious use of inversions to solidify and legitimate power and terror. Or as I heard, this was really great. Last week we had Angela Davis and Ta-Nehisi Coates give a talk on activism at the University of Michigan. And Coates had this great formulation about the use, the invocation of free speech to shut people up. That was his term. I thought that was really great. So that's inversion, that's subversion from above. Whatever you call it, the harnessing of progressive causes, or just liberal affordances, free speech. It's not progressive in itself. The harnessing of progressive causes or liberal affordances to right-wing ends lends itself to a confusion of political polarities. I would describe this confusion as endemic to the Metapolitical project. As such, it has profound consequences for the way we think of culture and counterculture in a democracy, as we already saw in the rereading of Orwell that defined neither communism nor fascism, but representative democracy itself as soft totalitarianism and the simulation of democracy. I'll come back to this in concluding. But first, let me outline, by way of just a small sampling, how metapolitics burrows into left-wing or progressive concepts through an aggressive form of appropriation. In the process, I'll show those concepts become hollowed out and perverted as the New Right turns them inside out. Perhaps the most glaring examples of this process involve the politics of identity, a term explicitly captured by the right in its self-description as identitarian. And I think I need to think a little bit more about this. This is more in the European New Right than in the American New Right. And although there was, there's famously an identitarian movement that starts in France as the Génération Identitaire and then becomes the IB, Identitäre Bewegung in Austria, headed by Martin Sellner. And that's really gained some traction and is still very much around in the thinking of the New Right. In the US, that didn't quite take off. There was there's a Identity Europa movement in the US, then renamed, I think, American Renaissance, and then they folded. So something in the US configuration, I think mainly of race and whiteness in this case, militates against the use of identitarian. But I'd love to hear if you think otherwise, if this is a term that is more familiar to you in some American context that I haven't been tracking. I do find it useful as a blanket term because to my mind it covers, it's quite productive in covering things like white supremacist movements as identitarian. From the use of this term, from identitarian, the politics of identity ramifies through everything from Zellner's ethno-nationalist migration politics, that's the remigration book, to the politics of victimhood, to the trolling of movements such as feminism, gay liberation, or anti-racism. Take, for example, the notion of straight pride, formulated as a parodistic and demeaning rejoinder, obviously, to gay pride. More recently, the term has served as a rallying cry for agitational formats that would have been anathema to an earlier conservatism. Major cities such as Boston and San Francisco saw straight pride parades in the late 2010s. And in 2023, the far right in Germany launched an extended Stolzmonat campaign. A literal translation of Pride Month, Stolzmonat. The coordinated social media drive took direct aim at the LGBTQ+ community, which it impugned for its, their terms, rainbow crap and gender madness. But it did so by appropriating and resignifying the organizing notion of queer pride, as well as the use of rainbow overlays for profile pictures during Pride Month. Only now, pride, or Stolz, was to be patriotic, or German, and the rainbow was replaced by the gradated colors of the German flag. Celebrated by Sellner and others as a resounding success, Stolzmonat appropriated and distorted the appeal of Pride Month for the recognition of difference and diversity, and replaced it with an assertion of nationalism and tradition. More than just a way of owning the libs, as New Right parlance has it, this campaign appropriated the terms and agitational strategies of progressive identity politics to actively exclude from national belonging those who would identify with or simply support LGBTQ+ rights. I offer straight Pride Month as an example of what I'd call the identitarian reflex of a new right that decries the excesses of identity politics but adopts identitarianism as one of its own platforms. This is the same reflexive gesture of appropriation and aggressive resignification that attacks anti-racism for being anti-white racism and turns this grievance into slogans like White Lives Matter, White Power, or Stop White Genocide, or uses the language of racism to attack DEI programs. We talked about this yesterday, the repugnant racism that DEI programs are being accused of by the Department of Education of the United States. Like straight pride, all these phrases depend for their provocation on the movements and values they pervert, on the history and memory of Black power, on the Black Lives Matter moment and movement, and on the remembrance of historical genocide. Even when these phrases merely, in quotation marks, circulate as memes on the internet and social media, they exert semantic violence and impugn the cause of social justice while appropriating its language and even its playbook, from Gramsci to Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. Needless to say, the identitarian reflex can go hand in hand with the trolling and doxing of social justice warriors online, not to mention outright attacks. While references to the civil rights movement may be more characteristic for the US context, we can observe parallel moves in Europe, where even the naming of the far-right Alternative für Deutschland rewires earlier notions of a progressive alternative. The Greens were known as Die Alternativen for a long time. Built on an anti-migrant platform that it has managed to mainstream over the 10 years of its existence, the party was founded in opposition to the Willkommenskultur, the culture of welcome, Germany's unprecedented openness to migrants fleeing wars in Syria and Afghanistan in 2015. That opposition remains a central plank of its anti-immigration and pro-quote-unquote remigration politics. But the party has no problem also appropriating the malign term to promote a Willkommenskultur für deutsche Kinder. As another campaign poster had it, Deutsche Kinder machen wir selber. German children, we make them ourselves. For such contortions, the AfD draws liberally on the metapolitical cues generated in Schnellroda, cues that routinely involve the same resignification we've been describing. Here, the disdain politics of difference and ethnic diversity resurface as ethno-pluralism, a seemingly innocuous term that can function as a sort of entry drug to successively more exclusionary, supremacist, and always intended notions of ethno-nationalism and the white ethno-state. In these ways, metapolitics connects progressive notions such as the expansion of rights to minoritized identities, social justice, and equality to reactionary aims, to the return to a status quo ante, to remasculinization, to the exclusion of difference, and the quote-unquote protection of majoritarian identities that have been construed as immutable, traditional, and essential. Once this has been accomplished, or as part of the ironic culture through which this is to be accomplished, the identitarians can join the debate on anti-racism by claiming, counterfactually and cynically, 100% identity, 0% racism. A similarly confounding logic of reversal defines the new right's fraught interventions in German memory culture, or what pundits like Kubitschek and Sellner refer to as the country's Schuldkult, or its cult of guilt. The efforts of the AfD to minimize the role of the Holocaust in Germany and German history are by now well known. And if you watched Jan Böhmermann's op-ed piece in the New York Times this weekend, you saw him talk about that. That was pretty good. If you haven't seen it, it's a real great primer on what's going on in Germany right now. Just look up German comedian New York Times op-ed. The efforts of the AfD to minimize the role of the Holocaust in German history are by now well known. But the more perfidious tendency runs deeper and involves redefining the very notion of what it means for Germans to continue working through their nation's past. For the real Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit, or working through the past, the real working through the past, Martin Sellner would have us know, involves not confronting fascism or the Holocaust, but confronting the erosion of German identity in a process that the new right calls national or ethno-masochism. Coming to terms with the past, by this token, would mean undoing whatever progress the country may have made towards greater inclusivity, not to mention rights, for all of its citizens. It would mean rewinding the clock to remember and reassert the ethnic homogeneity of the German Volk. From here, it's just one further step backwards to the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft, which is the principal reason why large swaths of the AfD, as well as the operations in Schnellroda that I've been discussing, have been classified officially as right-wing extremist by the German Office for the Protection of the Constitution, which allows them to put them under increased surveillance. Confronted with such accusations, however, the right is quick to counterpunch by accusing the democratic institutions of totalitarian overreach. So as soon as you, I mean, this is the problem of liberal democracies. As soon as you have an Office for the Protection of the Constitution, which enforces the protections of the Constitution and puts members of the public, citizens, under surveillance, then those members will cry foul and see them and portray themselves as victim of, in the way they put it, totalitarian overreach. In the mirror funhouse of metapolitics, after all, racism is something suffered predominantly by whites. This is the fundamental proposition that Antaios author Martin Lichtmes spells out in pseudo-theoretical detail in his Kaplaken volume, Die Verteidigung des Eigenen, in defense of what is ours. The short treatise offers a case study in victim reversal. Although examples could be adduced from the US context, up to and including the privileging of white Afrikaners as refugees while the country steps up mass deportations of black and brown people, there is something about the arcane logic of Lichtmes's text that makes it exemplary. Even if the völkisch context for treatments of race in Germany differs from American racism and the history of slavery, the shared claim of white victimization on both sides of the Atlantic helps to give a sense of the insidious transnationalism of the new right. So let me say just a few words about how this text operates. Drawing on an admittedly sloppy reading of Frantz Fanon, the preeminent critic of colonialism, whom Lichtmes writes, he doesn't, quote, I'm quoting him, feel like reading in more than a cursory fascism. Doesn't matter, I'm going to draw on him. Drawing on an admittedly sloppy reading of Frantz Fanon, Lichtmes sets out to describe a renewed colonialism in the contemporary Western world. Except now the Germans, and by extension white Europeans and Anglo-Americans, appear not as colonizers, but, you guessed it, as victims of colonization themselves. Lichtmes seems aware of how implausible this reversal will sound to some, but he doubles down, insisting that beginning in 1945, quote, the German, der Deutsche. If anyone's read Viktor Klemperer's Language of the Third Reich, these kinds of formulations resonate in, the German, der Deutsche. That's the language of the Third Reich. So he insists that beginning in 1945, the German has become, quote, something like the N-word of Europe after 1945. Within this aggressive resignification, Lichtmes also, with this resignification, Lichtmes also buttresses the popular right-wing trope of Germany's forced democratization by the Allies after World War II. Adopting Frantz Fanon as unlikely guide, he implicitly ties Germany's pre-colonial identity, its true national self, to the moment prior to its subjugation from outside by American re-education. That is, he ties Germany's true self to Germany before 1945. This, too, is a recurring trope among the New Right, which, as the literary scholar Heinrich Dietering has shown in a really good little book, has filtered into German parliament through the speeches of the AfD. You can trace this, that if you pay close attention. And it's always with plausible deniability. It's always, oh, but I'm not saying Nazi. No, they aren't. But if you follow the logic of the rhetoric, it leads you to discover that making Germany great again means going back before 1945 and before the occupation by the Allies. And we know what before 1945 was. But Lichtmes is far from finished, going on to claim that colonial subjection now characterizes all white peoples, whom it saddles with white guilt. This is English in the original. A guilt that portends an auto-genocidal crisis of the whole Western world. This is again the language of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Occasionally cloaked in the above-mentioned hyperbole of white genocide, it manages to conflate racist and Holocaust imagery, to which Lichtmes adds an anti-Semitic twist by blaming white peoples, by blaming the ongoing colonial bondage of white peoples on the global dominance of Goldman Sachs. The trope of the rootless wandering Jew becomes the paradigm for the dislocation of the self, die Entortung des eigenen. So we had Kubitschek defending what is our own, die Verteidigung des eigenen. Here it is die Entortung des eigenen. No, I'm sorry, Lichtmes. The opposition to what he's defending is the dislocation of the self. And in this parable, Germany becomes a, quote, madhouse of depressive colonials and sleepwalkers who don't even recognize their own enslavement, end of quote. From there, it's only one step to the opposite trope, the self-identification of Germans as the Jews of Europe and the lament that anti-Germanism has become the new anti-Semitism. So much for the sharpening of concepts advocated by Kubitschek. We've arrived in a conceptual hall of mirrors in which everything is also its opposite, where colonizers are colonized, perpetrators are victims, democracy is dictatorship. Ellen Bures of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies has described this as what she calls performative anti-leftism, where the right has, quote, absorbed the signature culture war move of flipping the script, slandering the left in the same terms as intolerant, totalitarian, extremist, and even racist, used by the left to smear the right. This assessment is readily confirmed, but in describing the tit-for-tat logic of playground insults, and I always think of when Clinton accuses Trump in the debate, in the Clinton-Trump debate, remember that, of being a Russian puppet, all he knows to say is, no, you're the puppet. So in describing the tit-for-tat logic of playground insults, Bure's account leaves intact the very polarities of left and right that metapolitics is drawing into its vortex. It also suggests a certain symmetry, where instead, I think we should be paying attention to the production of false equivalences. The notion of flipping the script, moreover, conjures up the horseshoe theory of extremism, whereby political positions on the left and right begin to converge and resemble each other the further they depart from some perceived center. Not only does such a view reify the notion of the political middle as if that were a stable fixed point of gravity, when in fact it can only be defined relationally. Compelling metaphor that it is, moreover, the horseshoe theory occludes the different derivations of political extremes in favor of static similarities. It seems to me then that we need other explanatory models and that something more fundamental is going on. As Sasse, the author of Subversion from Above, puts it, quote, by leveling differences, conceptual reversals of the kind we've been tracing, quote, frustrate the ability to differentiate and complicate the work of critique. Infatuated with Orwell, metapolitics generates its own Orwellian mindscapes, in which it becomes difficult to discern logic from counterlogic, perception from projection, fact from fiction. A conceptual funhouse in which contradictions collapse. This was the experience that motivated Naomi Klein to explore the strange equivocations by which she routinely becomes confused with other Naomi, as she puts it in her book, the MAGA adherent Naomi Wolf. Aptly titled Doppelganger, the thought-provoking book explores a MAGA mirror world to discover that, this is now Naomi Klein writing, on either side of the reflective glass, we're not having disagreements about differing interpretations of reality. We're having disagreements, she writes, about who is in reality and who is in a simulation. The resulting disorientation, this is me again, I submit, is strategic and central to what Martin Jay has called the dialectics of counter-enlightenment. Drawing on the languages of emancipation, even on Kant and his concept of the emergence from our self-imposed immaturity, his definition of enlightenment, drawing on languages of common sense and the common good, of victimhood and empowerment, metapolitics constructs the reflective surfaces of Klein's mirror world out of the scraps of Enlightenment discourse and claims democracy on its side. As Klein writes, quote, the horror of the society that flips fascist from within, without the aid of foreign invasion, lies precisely in this unsettling feeling of familiarity, end of quote. But that familiarity, I want to reiterate, is not based on symmetry. In this sense, even Klein's mirror image is misleading, in that it suggests a faithful, passive reflection of leftist assumptions on the right, and perhaps vice versa. As we've seen, those assumptions become massively distorted in the mirror funhouse of metapolitics. Attractive as it is, then, the metaphorical arsenal of mirrors and simulations occludes one important ingredient, the subjective agency of those who populate the mirror maze. In that space, it seems to me, metapolitics ultimately operates on a logic not simply of reflection, however distorted, but also of projection. Viewed in this light, the reversals of colonizer and colonized, democracy and authoritarianism, oppressor and victim, originate not so much on the new left from where metapolitics borrows its language and derives its concepts, but from the authoritarian fantasies and white supremacist leanings of the new right itself. The latter claims to speak in the name of an allegedly silenced, ostracized, and victimized position that needs to heroically defend itself against a reigning left-wing orthodoxy. But if we look at how that orthodoxy is constructed in the writings of the new right, it turns out to be a massive projection of authoritarian and identitarian leanings. The ostensible left liberal consensus amounts to a Gedankenterror, a thought terror, of Orwellian dimensions, and the new right sees its dream of an ethnopolitics realized as postmodern identity politics, a nightmarish projection. The new right shares this tendency toward projection with anti-Semitism, which Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer analyzed in precisely these terms during the 1940s. Drawing on Freud, for whom projection and paranoia were intimately connected, they trace anti-Semitism to, quote, the transference of socially tabooed impulses from the subject to the object. The things I fantasize or fear or repress, I transfer, project out so that I can persecute it in the other. Through a form of abreaction, the subject legitimates hatred for the outside world, whose ostensible malign intentions are so many projections of the subject's own inner impulses. As Adorno puts it in an analysis of the techniques of fascist agitators, in the United States during the 1930s and 40s, I'll come back to that tomorrow, quote, fascist and anti-Semitic propagandists blame their victims in an almost compulsory way for exactly the things which they themselves are doing or hope to do. Other commentators have adopted this analysis, identifying similar patterns on the alt-right and in the alt-right conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism in particular. And when the Department of Education, in its recent Dear Colleague letter, accuses DEI initiatives of pervasive and repugnant racism in the name of colorblind procedures, it is difficult to avoid reading this as anything other than the projection of barely tabooed white supremacist longings onto the achievements of the very Civil Rights Act that the letter invokes. What complicates this analysis in the final instance, however, is the fact that it too has meanwhile been integrated into the pathology it is designed to analyze. In 2017, Antaios published a key volume by two of its A-list authors, the same Martin Lichtmes, who we studied looking at Frantz Fanon, and Caroline Sommerfeld, a very interesting figure on the far right. We can talk about her. Entitled, and one of two women in the entire Schneider-Broda cosmos. Entitled Mit linken Leben, Living with the Left, it contains a loose assemblage of vignettes, definitions, cliches, critiques of cliches, advice for living, and codes of conduct to help define the right attitude toward the left. As such, it belongs, like the cultural technique of right-wing reading that we started with, to a form of new right intellectual self-help. It is designed to provide orientation, to be useful. Among the signposts to the right life, they come up with the slogan, rechts ist richtig, links is wrong. We find the author's own law of projection. Quote, everything written by professional unmaskers and enlighteners against the right, or right-wingers, people like me, is nothing but a projection of their own character traits, structures of thought, or modi operandi. Always, period, without exception, period. Promptly naming the apodictic formulation for themselves, they call it the Lichtfels-Sommerfeld law, or LSG, the authors soon remediated their book in the form of a hashtag on Twitter, where the search for hashtag Lichtmess-Sommerfeld-Gesetz would yield plenty of examples of the right trolling the left for moments of pathic projection. At this point, we've traveled through the looking glass. Lichtfels and Sommerfeld would have us escape the circularity of projection and counter-projection by identifying as culprit whoever did it first. Back to the playground. This strikes me both as infantile and as structurally paranoid. If we wish to obtain any leverage on the spiraling logic of projection and counter-projection, then, we need to step off the conceptual carousel of metapolitical spin and regain our bearings. For this purpose, we might turn to theoretical models such as Michel Foucault's work on the relationship between truth and power, to Hannah Arendt's influential discussions of truth and lying in politics, or to Sophia Rosenfeld's assessment of the tenuous history of democracy and truth in her recent book by that title. Their writings would allow us to rise above the fog of battle over discursive hegemony and recognize the mirror effects of metapolitics, the confusions of projection and counter-projection, not simply as equivocations, but as an end in itself, a desired outcome. For as Hannah Arendt writes in The Origins of Totalitarianism, quote, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, that is, the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, that is, the standards of thought, no longer exist. Or we might see the metapolitical machinations on both sides of the Atlantic for what they are, not as the sharpening of concepts, but as a propaganda operation, in line with earlier forms of fascist agitation that reach back to the middle of the last century at least. Taking the long view of metapolitics, we might then recognize the historical resonances also with earlier attempts to explain the workings of such propaganda. For example, in adopting the accelerationist stance and pursuing appropriative strategies that we've been looking at, Metapolitic not only countenances, but actively fosters the same disorientation that the cultural critic and theorist Siegfried Kracauer, back to him, found to be the goal of totalitarian propaganda almost a century ago. In a draft that remained unpublished during his lifetime, but has recently begun to receive scholarly attention, Kracauer describes propaganda fundamentally as such a project of disorientation. In the tumult of propaganda, he writes, nothing holds. Down is up and up is down. Propagandists, he says, totally turn truth on its head by blaming the opponent for just those actions and machinations that they themselves are pursuing. The contemporaneity of such an assessment should give us pause and prompt us to revisit the present in light of the earlier historical moment of fascism about which Kracauer and his fellow émigrés were concerned and writing quite prolifically. And that is what we'll do tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you. We have time for some questions, but I'm going to kick it off, as is my right. I was making note of some of the Kubitschek, the Kaplakin books.
The titles?
The titles were very, I mean, in terms of projection, if you could say anything, I'm thinking of the titles are things like Gleichschaltung, are they pro? Poland, 1939. Yeah. The White Rose, which was a resistance group. So how are they managing? I mean, you've given us plenty of examples of how this is happening, but it really sort of boggles the mind.
Yeah. I don't know the Gleichschaltung volume. Poland 1939, I have an anecdote, but maybe this is instructive. So, to my consternation, I found my name in one of these volumes. And I thought, how and why? And I'm pretty sure that what happened was they must have attended a lecture I gave on a film called Heimkehr from 1941, Nazi propaganda film. Along with Jutsu's probably the most vile piece of Nazi propaganda, I mean, and The Eternal Jew, which is a documentary, but one of the most vile but also kind of textbook examples of Nazi propaganda that I know, because it's a case study in projection. It's made in 1941 in order to retroactively justify the invasion of Poland in 1939. And how do they do that? They show that the Germans were under such attack by Poles, the ethnic Germans living in Poland were under such attack by Poles that the German invasion wasn't just okay, it was called for. And if you start looking at the film and how the Germans are subject to Polish, to discrimination by the Poles, it's they are forbidden to assemble. Their books are burned. That's the first scene of the film. When they are, they're rounded up on flatbed trucks and transported into a closed cellar where guns are pointed at them from above through little openings in the ceiling. I mean, it's simply, and this is 1941, the Wannsee Conference hadn't happened yet, but it's simply the planning for the extermination of the Jews of Europe, which is used in order to make a fiction film about how the Germans are victims of the Poles. So I explained that, and then afterwards, these two young men, who I now think are authors in the Kaplakin series, came up to me and like, but really, I mean, the Poles, they were really bad to the Germans. I'm like, yes, there was ethnic strife in Poland, but do you see what you're doing by saying but the Poles? This is maybe a kind of historical revisionism, and that's what the Poland, the fascination with Poland is about. Yeah, we talked about die Verteidigung des eigenen. gegen die Liberalen, against the liberals, is clear enough. That's Mola. That's one of the founding. So some of this is historical work. Like they republish texts in this series, but a lot of it feels like it's sort of written for blogs and then turned into. I mean, there's like 70, 80-page essays. They look like real books, and they have this great snake motif going. But some of them are really, very kind of superficial. So they don't all, and you might even think that the one that I did spend time with, the Lichtmess, doesn't really merit spending time with, because such a reading of Fanon is just, why are we even discussing it? But I think it's because because it exemplifies the overall project.
Great, and we have time for questions. Yes.
Sure. Yeah, I'm wondering if any optimism can be seen out of the transitory nature of far-right politics in Germany. I guess what I'm thinking of is the NPD.
Oh.
I mean, when it first became publicly known outside of Germany in the late 60s and early 70s, there was fear that was little more than a revival of National Socialism in disguise. But now, 50 or 60 years later, the NPD is largely passé. Yeah. So I'm wondering if any hope or optimism can be seen from the fact that a lot of these political parties seem to have this ability to just come and go. Yeah. Thanks.
That's a really great question, and I'm afraid that my answer is no. Because the way I've started thinking about this is, I mean, I mentioned yesterday that I think this is a long game, and I think like Mola, he was the one who kind of wrote a dissertation about the conservative revolution in the 1950s, and that gets picked up, and then these things get spun forward and they leapfrog a little bit, and NPD is a really good example, because you're right. It crops up, it doesn't make the 5%, it kind of falls away again. And though people were very nervous about it, including Adorno in a really interesting speech to students in Vienna in 1969, warning of the resurgence of fascism. I guess the way I describe it is, we can talk about waves, but the amplitudes keep getting bigger. I mean, that the AfD is now at 40, 47% in some parts of East Germany, makes it hard to think that it's just going to go away. And I think if you look at metapolitics as the concept as something developed, by Benoit around 1970, that's what we're now harvesting. So I think there is a kind of long-term germination rather than coming and going. I'll say on the other side of the Atlantic very briefly that, did I mention this yesterday or is it tomorrow? It's getting confused now. Rachel Maddow did this great podcast called Ultra. Did anyone hear that? A couple people. I thought it was really remarkable, and she's done another one. And then she published a book called Prequel, which is about the rise of fascism and the flirtation with fascism that I want to talk about tomorrow a little bit more, and I already mentioned yesterday, in the US. And she makes your argument, basically, that the institutions held. We got pretty close in this country to sedition, attacks on government, raiding of armories, silver shirts in the streets. There was a lot of, and up to the highest echelons of Congress. But she says the courts held, investigative journalism held, and voters voted them out of power. Now the question becomes, but that's for political scientists, what do we do with gerrymandering? Where are the courts today? And who has access anymore if you're talking about journalism?
Thanks, Johannes. It's great to have you here, and I learn a ton every time I get to hear you speak. So, the Orwell stuff and the PragerU stuff got me thinking about how much is sincerely held principled beliefs that people have versus, I guess the way I think about it is performative lying or tribal identification.
Yeah.
Right, and does that matter
Right.
in terms of how we think about fighting back against it? Right, because if it's the latter, logical facts and evidence and things like that don't break through people's media bubbles or political talk circles and things like that, because it's sort of it's identitarian, as you were talking about. So interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to the. So I talked yesterday briefly about the performative aspect of this, and where I think it's always important to say, but I think you're implying that if you say, like sometimes we glibly say, oh, it's just performative, but I don't think that's what you're saying. I think you're saying the performative has a content and a function, and it's tribal and effective as such. And I think you're right to ask.
I don't even necessarily believe it.
Right.
Right. But I am engaging in this rhetoric.
Right.
Using this language.
Right.
Turning things around.
Right.
That way, because I am part of this group that it requires.
Right. And although I use the language of psychoanalysis to describe the mechanism of projection, I'm not speaking of individual intentions. Like I wouldn't try to psychoanalyze Martin Lichtmes or Steve Bannon for the life of me. But so I, as a whole, I think I fall pretty squarely on the side of it's performative, it's iterative. So you get these kind of bits and pieces. I mean, Orwell just floats and he kind of bubbles up, and then becomes reflexive and almost rote, but again, still effective. What does that mean for responding? I think you're also right. I mean, I think, so when Adorno writes, well, I'll talk about this tomorrow. When Adorno writes about the NPD in 1969, he says we really need to drastically name these concepts. So the Frankfurt School still has an Enlightenment idea of we're going to counter this with rational argument. We're going to show where the contradictions lie. And to some degree, obviously, that inspires my project, right? I mean, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this. I do think it's worth pointing out that these things are false equivalences, that the things I've been saying. But there's something also nihilistic about this project. So Ofer was asking me yesterday, like, what's the end game? And Krakow already says that about fascism. He says it's a nihilistic power. It's simply about power. It's not about the production of concepts or anything. And the power, if you put it in these accelerationist terms, then nihilism is totally fine. And I think that might be one place to start. Like, how does one counter nihilism? And the other one is Adorno himself has a really interesting moment where, for all the dialectics that he does, I mean, he's definitely, if anybody was ever into like the production of concepts or the sharpening of concepts, it's definitely Adorno. But he says it's all ideology critique. I show the underlying mechanism of this in order then to enlighten people and critique the ideological construction of it. But he says that entire method, he himself says this, the entire method fails when you get to propaganda. Because propaganda has no underlying truth content that you could draw out. And so he says when we're dealing with propaganda, we can't do ideology critique. We can't engage on the level of this is the right, this is the wrong concept. We have to analyze power. And we have to, so that's why I think also Foucault might be useful, but yeah.
We'll collect a couple questions now, here, and then.
Thank you so much. This was a phenomenal talk. I have two questions, which I don't expect you to answer, but maybe we can have it as a starting point for a conversation. So one is just to have you say a little bit more about the New Left and how it shows up, perhaps in the text we're looking at right now, but more broadly in the readings that you've been doing. Would you say that its role is similar to how you discussed Fanon's appropriation and kind of gleeful misreading and superficial reading of. So, for instance, does Foucault figure that way? Because he certainly should be attractive too, post-truth, et cetera. I mean, I hear that we should read him, but anyway, you see what I'm saying. So how deeply actually have any of the thinkers that you've encountered grappled with the thinking of the New Left around, media, the establishment, tactics, as you mentioned, et cetera, et cetera. And then my second thought, and this is really where it's a much longer conversation, is around how to respond, right? Which clearly is animating you and all of us right now. And I wonder, so it seems as though, here, okay, I'll put it in question form. To what extent would you say that large swaths of people who are voting for these parties have read any of these texts? And, and if they've seen a single social media post, from whom would it be? And, basically, a tactic is to address the grievances of everyday voters, which may or may not have anything to do with these, as you put it so well, funhouse mirrors that the intellectuals or self-appointed intellectuals of the movement have developed. So to what extent are you seeing, and I hate to use this phrase, but a trickle down? And to what extent is it that perhaps there's some loose sense in which, concern about immigration sounds like the intense racism that we see in these texts, but it may not quite be the same thing. And to put it a little provocatively, it might be unfair of us to see it as the same thing, if that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Could you tell us something about the socioeconomic class of the producers and consumers of these materials?
Thanks for those are both great questions. You're repeating a question that came up yesterday, which is like, what's the class analysis of all this? And I think it's one I have to think a lot more about. I've been tracing, ethnonationalism and race to some degree, but class less. And I think it's a completely relevant and interesting question. And I fear that if I start answering it, I'm just going to get into generalities that might not be useful. So let me think about it a little more. Maybe I can think about it overnight and say something more. I should have thought about it already last night. So, thanks. I really take the point that this is an important question. Yeah, you had a lot of questions. So,
Whatever you're in the mood to answer.
So the first one was about the New Left and how it shows up. It depends, obviously, what we mean by the New Left. So Saul Alinsky comes up a lot. Rules for Radicals is like, that's a really good text. We need to use that. So it becomes just appropriated. And the very notion of a counter-public sphere, I don't, did they read, Habermas or, I don't know. Some of them probably did. I think where it crops up and this is one area that I've studied fairly extensively. That's not part of the lectures, but I think will be part of the book, is in the conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism, which is attributed to the Frankfurt School, with which I'm trying to analyze this. So there's a real kind of, it's not a real engagement. So I don't think they're carefully reading Adorno or Horkheimer or Marcuse. But it is a reflexive referral to the thinkers, theorists who in the 60s were animating a lot of the student movement. And they're held responsible for all sorts of things. and the decline of the West, basically, and the rise of African American studies and feminism, which is not exactly what I'd lay at the doorstep of critical theory, but that's how that conspiracy theory happens to work. I heard you going also in terms of what the new left would be into the kind of direction of Foucault, would it like a certain kind of theoretical constellation that I identify with the sort of the 80s and maybe the 90s. Would that, does that get read by them for their kind of theoretical toolkit? And it's interesting to note that there's talks in Schnellroda, like delivered, that you can listen to online, against postmodernism as being too critical, as being too, so, and then, Foucault is part of it, and Deleuze, and, they kind of fold everything into that. And so there's a critique, such as it is, of that kind of new left. I did want to respond to the trickle-down question, which I think is great. I'm sorry to pick that term out, but so right. I mean, I think other people have asked me this, and I think it's a totally relevant question. This might be a small group. It might be an elite group in terms of like socioeconomic status. Who's reading it? Where do its effects really crop up if you do a kind of cause and effect analysis? I have two thoughts on that. One is, as we were discussing on the way in, I've said a couple times, like the idea of reading is really important to them. They have a canon, especially in Germany, but there's a America First reading list here too in the United States. There's something you should read. You should know this, and then they produce literature and like blogs and little things on the things they think are important to read. They write articles. They do little author portraits of the authors they think are significant. And it seems to me that if you're a student in your teens today and are surfing the web for material for your seminar paper, these are kind of starting to bubble up. That at least was a concern of the research project that I mentioned yesterday that's underway in Germany on right-wing reading. And I think, so that's one area where I would be paying attention. The more concrete example is remigration. Remigration is a term of art designed to, quote unquote, move the Overton window away from immigration, designed to get people into a mode of thought where immigration becomes anathema and sending people back becomes logical. And human rights are no longer a question, those kinds of things. Zerna writes this book. I forget when it's actually published. In late 2023, there was a meeting among the kind of the think tank people, right, and party people. So there's a link between metapolitics and politics right there in terms of personal connections. And they met in a hotel and they discussed, among other things, the master plan for remigration. There is an investigative journalist who uncovered this and infiltrated it and published it in early 2024. In Germany, it led to massive street demonstrations. It's the first time it felt like we were back in the streets. And by we, I mean just like the populace. I don't know if you went, but it was like we were in Berlin at the time, Mark and I, and there were hundreds of thousands, and it was kind of pro-democratic movement that unleashed. Remigration is a term that is now used in political parlance. The AfD uses it as part of its platform. Alice Weidel uses it at party congresses. And I think you'll find, I haven't looked, but I'm pretty sure if you look, you'll find it used without quotation marks in newspapers. That to me is a direct metapolitical success, if you want to call it that, or trickle-down effect. Yeah.
Did you have your hand? Okay, yes, it's okay. We're officially scheduled till 1:15 actually,
okay.
But if people need to leave, we understand.
Yeah.
But, okay.
I will make this very, very brief. After everything you said, Johannes, again, thank you so much. So getting rid of the AfD, is that even going to solve the problem? Because exactly what you were just describing, right? So the remigration is like, I mean, Alice Weidel not only uses it, but she was actually emphasizing it. Where she, like in her speeches before the election, said like, and if you want to call this remigration, I'm calling it. And she was repeating it several times. But we are seeing similar ideas now and similar strategies now also definitely in the CDU, and I would argue also in the Grünen.
It's coming, yes.
The Social Democrats to some degree. So it's, how do you want to counter this? It's like even if you want to get rid of, or you were to get rid of the AfD, and it looks like there might be a possibility, it's already, I feel like it has poisoned all of German politics and society. Seems like the only sane people are in the Linke, right? I mean, or the only ones uninfected yet, especially when it comes to migration. So what do we do with that?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's part of the analysis. That is that, like you said, that the metapolitics can be successful independently of its political realization in party politics. Yeah.
And I remember listening to, and I can't remember who it was, but it was, thank you, some AfD politician, probably 2 or 3 years ago, where he said, well, actually, we don't need to win the popular vote. It's important, more important for us to change the discourse. So we want to get people to follow our ideas.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. And Spencer said the same thing. Richard Spencer said the same thing in 2016. Same language.
I wanted to ask this question yesterday, but there wasn't an opportunity, so I bring it up now, and it's even more critical, I think, maybe after what you've talked about today. That is the German concept which we keep hearing about, wehrhafte Demokratie.
Yes.
Where do you position that in the various discourses that are going on now? So defensive democracy.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And again, I would probably ultimately defer to political scientists on this. So it's interesting for a number of reasons. One, for the observation of, by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, that is an instantiation of wehrhafte Demokratie. It's like we are protecting the Constitution by putting you under observation, because if you're against the Constitution, then we have means. That's the way it's defined. As soon as you say that, especially in an American context, you hear the flip side of this, which is free speech absolutism, right? Which becomes a really effective tool that the new right has been mobilizing for a long time here, I think. And I remember when Richard Spencer wanted to come talk at our institution, and it's like free speech, let him speak, but it's not academic. We've had the conversations, I think. There's a famous legal scholar, you probably know this, in Germany called Ernst Wolfgang Böckenfelde, who formulated a kind of, it's called the Böckenfelde dictum because it's so important, which says that, I can't do it verbatim, but something like, the liberal democracy relies for its continued existence on premises that it is unable to enforce. And the idea of wehrhafte Demokratie is an attempt to do an end run around that problem. But if you enforce it too strongly, then it's no longer a liberal democracy, by definition. So he goes on in an interesting way to say, well, what's needed in that case are kind of binding values and norms that we all kind of subscribe to, so that we can disagree in parliaments and things like that. And Jan Assmann, who was here as one of the Mosse Lectures, is that right? Jan Assmann and Aleida Assmann together, the last book he wrote before he passed away, together with his wife, is about the common good as like the plug to fill the hole that dictum puts in democracy, right? That it just like there's always the risk that it's going to run out at the bottom, and so we're going to plug it with like a recommitment to the common good. I think that's a marvelous sentiment, but it's somewhat sentimental to me. I mean, if you read the book, it's the idea is like we have to recommit to, being good to each other and being together. And as one colleague quipped in Germany, it's kind of Kirchentag rhetoric, like when the Protestants get together and sing their songs for one day a year to reinforce, feeling good about the social glue that binds us. So I don't have a real answer. I think the dictum stands. It's a real problem, and right now we have people who are using that dictum as a weapon. That's the whole point, right? They understand that as well as anybody else, and they're saying, so let's push into exactly that hole. And I think Orban's whole idea of an illiberal democracy is exactly that. And I think we're seeing it right now here. It's exactly that.
We have time for just one more question. I saw a hand here.
I was really struck by that, the poster where it said 100% identity, 0% race. And I was wondering if you could comment on, is that sort of experienced by its proponents as almost inclusive? So whereas race is like a genetic concept, it's immutable, identity is something that, so it's almost like this is a movement of people who identify as white rather than coming from a particular place or something. So is there a way in which this is like almost an inclusive movement experienced by them, or sort of,
I think that would be perfectly in keeping with this what I've kept on calling resignification, right? That you can redefine exclusion as inclusion. And if you read the remigration, it'll say, well, we've got room for some more people, just not too many, as long as they assimilate his language. And the model, by the way, is the Exclusion Acts of 1924 or something in the US. So the model for German migration policy is 1924 American migration policy, which kept many Jews out of this country from the Holocaust. Anyway, so I think it's very much this idea that I could define identitarianism as a welcoming, inclusive space without the repugnant racism that a Trump regime would abhor. That kind of reversal is part of this logic. Yeah, I think so.
Wonderful. Please join us in thanking Johannes, and please come tomorrow for the last lecture.
Thanks.